Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history in 20-minute espresso shot episodes, served with a dash of personality. I am Hazel Baker, London tour guide and CEO of London Guided Walks, providing private tours, treasure hunts and live online quizzes to Londoners and visitors alike. To accompany this podcast, we also have hundreds of London history-related blog posts for you to enjoy, all absolutely free. We've also launched the Daily London, providing you with daily inspiration of things to do in London for Londoners. You can listen on iTunes, Spotify, or even add it to your Alexa Flash briefings. And you can check all of that out on our website, londonguidedwalks.co.uk/flash. Today we're going to be talking about the Wallbrook stream in the City of London during Roman times, and to help me navigate this is City of London tour guide McDiarmid. Hello. Okay, so we know the Walbrook stream began as springs in modern-day Islington and Shoreditch and flowed through central London, reaching the Thames by Cannon Street Station. Ian, to help those who aren't familiar with the Wallbrook or indeed the City of London, would you want to pinpoint the Wallbrook a little bit closer?
Yes, well, the first thing to say, obviously, that it is one of London's hidden rivers, so it's been covered up for a very long time now. In fact, by the end of the 15th century, it was getting incredibly narrow and was pretty much covered over for its entirety. It begins to the north of the city in what was Moorfields, and then ran southwards. And when we say it began round there, the beginnings of the Wallbrook covers a very wide area, and it's a very diverse thing to describe, because actually it's not really one stream, it's several streams coming from several springs. And those several springs then come together a bit further south and form one stream in what we term the Middle Wallbrook. And the Middle Wallbrook ran under where now the Bank of England is, and then it ran further south onto what is now underneath the Bloomberg building, formerly Bucklersbury House, before Bucklersbury House was pulled down. And Bloomberg building is on a road called Walbrook, and Walbrook Road is a little to the east of where the Wallbrook ran, and then it ran down to the Thames, and its mouth was there on the Thames near Cannon Street Station. So as I was saying, this is completely hidden, and this is one of those sort of fascinating historical aspects to London when you can't really see anything of what you're talking about, but you're talking about something that was of immense importance. So, as I was saying, we can divide the Wallbrook stream up into three parts. I should actually say that it's only a mile long, so we're doing a podcast now on a kind of trip down a river, and it's a bit like doing or watching one of those BBC documentaries when somebody like Michael Palin goes down the Nile or the Danube. A bit similar, except that our river or stream, more properly, is only about a mile long. So the northern parts of this, as I said, cover quite a wide area, and this is the Upper Wallbrook. And we've got to think of a series of, as I say, small streams fed by springs. And when the Romans arrive in London, this area is very, very marshy. And they begin to develop it around 90 to around 120 it gets going AD. And so this is a bit after the first Roman settlement of London. They conquer in 43, and the first bit of archaeology, which we'll probably come to a bit later, is 47 AD. And the thing that distinguishes this area in terms of archaeological finds is industrial activity. So this is the part of Roman London where industrial activity was most concentrated. And we're talking about finds of leather working, metal working, glass working, and also pottery as well. And so I was saying earlier that for me, one of the interests of this is that there's not much to see and you've got to recreate it in your imagination. I remember walking up Moorgate a few weeks ago and just making a mental note of 20 to 24 Moorgate, which is on your left as you walk up Moorgate towards the Bank of England. I say walk up, that's heading in a southerly direction. And this is a completely unremarkable building. They put it up in 1999. They did the archaeology underneath there, and they found the remains of kilns. So to me, that's kind of really interesting. Hazel, you've been interested in the Crossrail excavations.
Yeah.
Could you explain where they were and what they found?
Yeah, so the Crossrail excavations have been doing the Broadgate and the Liverpool Street one. That's what I've been reading up about. And it's really quite fascinating. So in modern day maps, Blomfield Street is where the Wallbrook would have originally ran. In Roman times, don't forget, public buildings would have been onside the main roads leading out of the city. It was a legal necessity and also the custom to bury dead outside the town boundaries. So I think you know where I'm going with this one. And Wallbrook was a fast-flowing stream and the area was prone to flooding. Cemetery areas nearest to the stream's tributaries must have been constantly waterlogged, and that's good for finding finds. And the pastures that weren't used for cemetery sites were used for military horses.
No, how do they know that?
Oh, well, by the bugs that they found in the soil. They're called decomposters, and they're associated with stable waste.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I remember reading about the Upper Wallbrook is, I think a bit before when you're talking about, is the exposure of bodies in the reed beds in the Iron Age, carrying on into the Roman Age. And you mentioned that the stream is fairly fast flowing. In the Lower Wallbrook, they found a lot of skulls, and when these were found, it gave rise to some fanciful theories about battles, and whether during the Boudiccan revolt, and I think some modern scholars maintain that they could be people who were executed during the Boudiccan revolt. But the more likely explanation is, I think, of the of bodies being exposed in the river, and the skulls perhaps being detached at the time of the bodies being laid down, and then being carried down by the water to the Lower Wallbrook. Is there anything about that in the Crossrail, or is it later and is it burial?
People love to add these stories, and you see a head and you think, oh well, it's not attached to the body, so it must have been deliberately taken off, but there's no evidence for that at all. So the modern day view really is that these heads came off because of the flooding and moved down the river, as with lots of other items.
Okay, and what about the cemeteries? Is there anything of particular note that they found there?
Yeah, so they've found a number of things, including coins, some beautiful coins, including one from Trajan, and another one Hadrian. Another one also specifically representing the province of Britannia.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds good.
Yeah. On a more gory note, if you like that kind of thing, they have found a horse's skeleton, partial skeleton, a male, 5 years old, and it's lying on its right side, and it's been part butchered. And they can tell that because of the knife marks in the front midshaft of the femur and also on a rib. But it also has evidence of canine gnawing.
Oh, nice. So that was something that was just left there, was it?
Yes, it looks like it was a deliberate deposit.
Okay.
And 5 years is pretty good going for any working horse.
Oh, that's interesting, because I think you were telling me that in Victorian times horses didn't live very long, did they?
No, they didn't. And then they ended up with glue afterwards.
Let's move on.
Yes. They also found a rare example of refined joinery from early Roman period. And these are 2 reused timber gates or barn doors. So going back to this whole pasture feeling of what the area was used yard. So they're thinking a farmyard or a workshop or some sort of ancillary building. And they reckon that this was done by a semi-skilled owner rather than a professional joiner, just by the way that it's done. But they're putting the date here at 110, 134 AD, and it's 2 metres wide. So quite sizable, so perfect for horses. And then also don't forget, at Draper's Gardens, they'd found 2 domestic-sized doors, and they were rather simple, but the most elaborate ones they've found over the years is on the Bloomberg site. And these are smaller sections, but they are 2 really elaborate panels. So you've got three examples of different types of joinery. The home DIYer to the professional joiner, all in these 3 examples.
And what about the burials themselves?
Yeah, well, of course, cemeteries usually flanked main roads, and Finsbury Circus Cemetery began in the late 1st century, and this is before the construction of the road that we know today, and it all continued for 200 years into the 3rd century, and they have found there, flanking some of Blomfield Road, they found examples of 125 human burials and also 10 cremations. And then at Liverpool Street, 5 burials and a partially articulated one. And also in the charnel, 7 individuals, including 6 adults, 1 male, definitely 1 female, and 1 sub-adult. And because they were found not as whole bodies in charnels along the side of the road, they're thinking that maybe the cemeteries were actually tidied up and these deposits were left in there. The bigger bones and also the foot bones were missing. That's a bit weird.
Yeah, why is that, do they think?
No idea. Maybe good luck charms? I don't know.
Oh.
So grave goods were found in smash pots, and some of the most beautiful ones were polychrome cable bracelets and also 2 bone hairpins. Also a probable iron medical instrument. So maybe he was a doctor. An iron stylus and also 2 iron slide keys. And mixed into all of this were 199 animal bone fragments.
So what animals did they find there then?
Well, mainly cattle and sheep and goats and pigs, dog, chicken, and then they also found single fragments of goose, roe deer, cod and horse.
Good mixture.
Shall we move to the middle Wallbrook then?
Yes, and this really, we can begin to talk about why the Wallbrook is so important. And it's important because it's an incredibly rich archaeological area. And the reason for this is the Wallbrook itself and that process I was talking earlier about, the building up of banks. So on the middle of the Wallbrook, they were constantly building up the banks, and they were gradually building up more solid areas where buildings could be erected. So you've got various levels of material being dumped, and this preserves archaeology very, very well because it's anaerobic. There's no oxygen in there. So you've got these various levels of building and you get lots of remains. And it's also very important for the history of archaeology because Bucklersbury House, which I was talking about earlier on, which was a huge building put up in the 1950s. And when they did that, the excavation before it was both extremely important but very limited. So this is the time when Professor Grimes excavates the Temple of Mithras, and this created huge interest at the time, people queuing around the block to see it. And at the same time, the Guildhall Museum, as then was, now later on became part of the Museum of London, was able to carry out some what we would call rescue archaeology, some rapid trenches. But an awful lot of the archaeology just was disappeared under the constructors' machinery. And you can see film clips at the time of these huge bulldozers moving masses of earth. And the archaeology that went must have been, it's tragic to think of it. But the resultant outcry over that led to some of the beginnings of the restrictions on development in the city and the beginnings of the current regime whereby you have to undertake archaeological surveys and archaeological digs if you want to put a new building up. And the area was also very important because they had to... The Wallbrook came, as we were saying, north-south, and it's to the western side of the city, but the city developed beyond it, so they had to put a bridge across. And the bridge went across roughly where number 1 Poultry is, so that's kind of opposite the Bank of England. So it was an enormous important part in terms of the traffic because that's where you got the main East Road. And this area was used for a mixture of residential building and industrial use.
And there's several writing tablets found there, weren't there?
Yes. So they the writing tablets are pieces of wood, and the ones that survive can be of two types. They can either be the background on which they put a layer of wax, which they'd inscribe, and sometimes the stylus marks have left writing that can be deciphered on scratched into the wood, or they could have used them a bit like a postcard by writing directly onto them. And because of these anaerobic conditions, these tablets have survived in this area, and they haven't survived from elsewhere. So number one Poultry was excavated in the 1980s when that building goes up, and they find some fascinating tablets there. My favourite one relates to the sale of, I say favourite, I don't mean this in a trivial way, I'm a favourite in the sense of finding it very interesting, relates to the sale of Fortunata, who's a slave woman, and she's bought for 600 denarii by Wigatius. That's a very interesting one.
I remember you mentioning that one on your Roman London tour as well, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting because Wigatius himself is a slave, and his owner is a slave, an imperial slave. So you've got a slave being bought by a slave of a slave, which is very interesting. Anyway, so they're important. But then when they did the Bloomberg, I was saying that a lot of the archaeology was destroyed when they put up Bucklersbury House, but nevertheless, when they did Bloomberg, they obviously did thorough research, and it was still a very rich site. And they re-excavated the Mithraeum, which you can go and visit in the Bloomberg building. But also, when you go and visit the Mithraeum, on display there, they've got fantastic cabinets full of finds from everyday life in Roman London. So that's well worth seeing. And also on the Bloomberg site, they found loads of these wooden writing tablets. So there were more found on the Bloomberg site than we had in existence before the Bloomberg site was uncovered. And amongst these is one with a scratched marking, Mogontio Londinio, which is the first reference to London that we've got, and that means to Mogontius at London. It's the address for the letter. And the Bloomberg writing tablets tend to be commercial or legal agreements, and they include the first written document that we've got from Roman London, which dates to 56 AD, which is a financial transaction between two freedmen. Mm-hmm. And then if we move further down, finally, to the end of the river, the lower Wallbrook, this is an area which hasn't really been excavated thoroughly because it's built on and the opportunities haven't arisen. But we're talking where Upper Thames Street is now. That's where the river was. And there was one archaeological dig done there in the 1950s by Grimes, who took a cross-section of that. And from that, we know that the mouth of this stream was about 6 metres wide. So very, very wide stream. And also we can tell that they put terraces on it so that it became a kind of rectangular shape, the mouth of the river, and that was very convenient for mooring up ships. So the area was of enormous commercial importance.
So that gets this straight in my mind. So you've got the City of London with its new Roman wall surrounding it, and then they build an extension of that wall from Blackfriars to basically where the Tower of London is now and Tower Hill, and you've got the Wallbrook right in the middle of that. So what happened with that?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure. I'm going to guess, because I know what they did at the northern end, which is just to have a channel running underneath the wall. Is that what happened here?
Well, one would assume so. So I do know that they made some provisions to allow drainage through the wall, but I think that's from the 1950s dig with, what's his name?
Grimes.
That's right, him.
Yeah. So what Hazel's talking about is in around 275 they build a riverside wall. The previous to that the walls had just gone around the landward part of London, and one implication of this wall is that the Wallbrook then ceases to be used for commercial activity, and indeed it must have been very difficult for London as a whole to operate as a port with this new wall in place.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the tour of the Wallbrook.
Oh, my pleasure.
That's all we've got time for now. Don't forget, Ian does provide a Roman London tour for you to get your teeth stuck into Roman London a little bit more. Many thanks to Andy, who has suggested a Rock and Roll London podcast. We will put that one on the list. And thank you to all of our listeners for your continued support, including Anne in Romford. If you have time, then leave us a review, and don't forget to check out The Daily London, giving you daily inspiration for things to do in London.